Today on World Traveler Commentary, we're going to discuss the Mar-a-Lago raid. And we're going to discuss different aspects of this raid from a couple of different viewpoints. Now, there's a certain kind of Democrat, usually white, middle class, still maybe facing some economic insecurity, but not massive systemic attacks, which is gloating over this raid and cheering it on and saying this is a great thing. But I actually haven't seen any of my African American friends gloating. I haven't seen any of my other ethnic minority friends gloating. I suspect they're looking on this the same way I am, in a mixture of schadenfreude and horror. And so I actually think there's a lot that needs to be unpacked here for people to be able to understand each other. Because the story we get from sort of your relatively well-off white supporter of the Democratic Party is nobody is above the law, look, we're going to prosecute Trump. The thing that you hear from a lot of Republicans is if they can go after Trump, they can go after anybody. Then the response to that will be, well, only if you break the law. And what's actually really interesting about this is a reversal of the rhetoric that we saw with the Black Lives Matter protests. And understanding that reversal, I think, gets at why I see this as nothing short of a political disaster waiting to happen for the Democrats. So first, I want to go over why I see this as with a little bit of schadenfreude, and I think that a lot of others, certainly outside the Republican Party, do as well. The fact is that the United States justice system has never really been even-handed, right? You don't have to go back very far in our history to see how the police were used to bully and even facilitate extrajudicial executions of African Americans via lynching and stuff like that. The criminal justice system in the U.S. has never been fair. And it hasn't gotten any more fair in recent years. The major transformations that we've seen have come from Republicans who see a lot of social problems as law and order problems, right? And in particular, they believe, honestly, that if we could just mechanically apply law and order, a lot of problems would go away. And so you've had things like mandatory sentencing guidelines, although they're basically rules. You have a lot of things like three strikes laws and stuff like this, which have been championed by Republicans and then validated by Democrats like Bill Clinton. And the problem here is that what we've seen is we've seen a shift from a court system which is run by judges to a court system which is run by prosecutors, where almost all prosecutions enter a plea deal, and so consequently, the more power you can give prosecutors, the more they can leverage in the law to negotiate these plea deals. Of course, that doesn't mean that everybody who pleads guilty then is guilty. That just means that we've seen more and more abuses by prosecutors, and this is the sort of thing that the right to a trial by jury and the right to confront witnesses and a lot of these other things were there to prevent. So that's where we get started. And the fact that this is now being thrown against a very powerful Republican when the Republican Party championed a lot of these changes inspires me with a little bit of view that, maybe now people will see the system for what it is. And I think that I think that on the surface you see a lot of indication that that might be the case. I'm not sure that's the case deeper though. The second problem that we have, and this is something that has been less well discussed, although I'm going to recommend a book on this. The book is Three Felonies a Day, How Feds Target the Innocent by Harvey Silverglate, formerly from the ACLU, the EFF, the FIRE, and a couple of other civil liberties groups. And what Harvey Silverglate discusses in his book is the move towards very vague and overly expansive interpretations of federal law. So, for example, Banking Secrecy Act requires reporting of financial transactions of more than $10,000, and it criminalizes, critically, efforts to evade this by structuring the financial transactions so that they don't hit that requirement. The problem with this is what counts as structure, right? So if I run a business and I have a policy of trying to invoice all of my customers for recurring services or for, let's say, hourly services before we hit $10,000, is that structuring or is it not? Is that a crime or is it not? And there are plenty of prosecutors that would pull that out of their hat and say, yes, it's a crime if they want to prosecute you. And otherwise, we'll just not care. So the aspect here is that there's an aspect of the criminal justice system in the United States which follows a philosophy very similar to that of Stalinist Russia, where Beria was said, show me the man and I'll find you the crime. And so there's a very real problem here that prosecutors can go after just about everyone, that federal laws are in fact enforced in such a vague way that prosecutors have argued, for example, that it is a crime, and a very heavy crime, akin to breaking into a computer to violate a website's terms of service. Look up the Lori Drew case. And there's not really a precedent to the contrary on that piece, although I think the Supreme Court recently kind of restricted the interpretation of that statute in a way that might, and I stress might, preclude that sort of prosecution in the future. And so this issue of vagueness in federal law is a very real one. And that problem's not going away. So failure to acknowledge that by Democrats and failure to acknowledge the systematic injustices of the federal justice system by Democrats has led to a bit of a mentality when we're looking at Rittenhouse, or when we're looking at Trump or things like that, that we're going to throw the entire might of the justice system against people we think are bad. And the problem with this is that justifies all of these systemic injustices. You're not going to reduce the unjust severity that Black Americans face in the criminal justice system by throwing the book harder at white folks. In fact, that's just going to shift things further towards the heavy enforcement direction. We should be working the other way. We should be working on making sure that that we provide more defendant protections. Something that, by the way, Sonia Sotomayor has been very good at advocating on the Supreme Court, just like Justice Stevens before her, and just like Justice Scalia. Gorsuch has also been pretty good on this topic. Also filling Scalia's shoes relatively well, probably not as well as Sotomayor has filled Stephen's shoes, though. So getting to this side of it, yes, it's true. If the feds want to target you, they can find a way. Okay? And the fact that people who don't accept plea deals get much longer prison sentences, we're not talking about an extra 10% or an extra 20%. We're usually talking about 5 or 10 times as long. That if you don't take a plea deal, you get really hit hard. This is the sort of thing which is going to encourage a lot of people to correctly assume that the U.S. criminal justice system can be used to target whoever a prosecutor wants to target. And that's, in fact, very true. So, I said a moment ago that I think that large parts of the country, including most Trump voters, are awakening, at least on a surface level, to the fact that the criminal justice system is like this. But I also said that I doubt that it goes very deep, and I'm going to explain why. The fact that rhetoric inverts itself like this, right? That suddenly the Democrats have become the thin blue line party, shows how much American politics and rhetoric is opportunistic rather than principles-based. Okay? Our political parties don't seem to operate from actual first principles and think through issues forward. They start from what do we want to do, and then they work backwards for their justification. So, and this goes, by the way, also for very ugly rhetoric. You saw a lot of sexist rhetoric against Hillary Clinton. You also saw a lot of sexist rhetoric against Sarah Palin. And the aspect of this that's really interesting is that rather than simply criticizing Palin for her record or things like this, people would resort to very sexist attacks, right? Same thing with Hillary Clinton. They would say sexist things about Hillary Clinton because it's much easier than actually getting into a discussion about what exactly you disagree with. And then this brings me back to Trump, okay? One of the things that was brilliant that Trump did in 2016, it was been totally missed by almost all commentaries and analysts, is that he ran on his opponent's record. Okay, I'm going to build a wall on the border of Mexico. Oh wait, we've been, and then the basic point on this is that Democrats then would have a choice of either attacking their own record, which they did in the case of the wall, or justifying their record, which they did in the case of making sure that immigrants could not be covered under the social safety net. And in both of these cases, one of two things is going to happen. Either they look like hypocrites, or they end up alienating their base, which is exactly what happened in 2016. Trump's whole campaign is, I'm going to be like her. And fortunately, I don't think he succeeded in that. But if you didn't like the Clintons the first time around, and if you didn't like Hillary Clinton's rhetoric on a bunch of other things, you certainly weren't going to go out and vote for her if her opponent was basically saying, I'm going to be just like her. And this was the key to Trump's success. Okay? It wasn't Russia. It was running as his opponent. He wasn't able to do that as well with Biden, but even so, in an election with turnout levels that should have been a Democratic landslide, in an economic catastrophe of COVID, he only barely lost. And so this gets to the question of a red wave. And I think that there are a couple of things you have to remember about a lot of this. First of all, as I've said before, American politics rhetoric is opportunistic. Parties do what their donors want and then justify it to their base later. The second thing is that the way things normally work is that in a presidential election year, the party that wins the election tends to pick up congressional seats. And then in a midterm election, the party that holds the presidency tends to lose congressional seats. So a red wave is almost certainly coming. That's normal, actually. Anybody who thinks it's not normal isn't paying attention. Interestingly, in 2016, Trump won the election and the Democrats gained seats, which again tells me that a big part of Trump's win was running on his opponent's record and therefore discouraging them from voting. Yeah, I'm going to be just as bad as she is. And then highlighting all of that discouraged a lot of people from voting and put Trump in office. So yeah, I think a red wave is coming. And I think the Democrats have just made that red wave quite a bit bigger because the political rhetoric around Mar-a-Lago is actually going to discourage their base from voting in many ways. And I say their base because at this point I don't care for either of the parties. The second thing I think you have to look at in this case is that the way politics works in the United States is that when one party tends to do something really bad, okay, that screws over the American people, the other party tends then to do something bad to screw over the American people. And the reason I think that this happens is that it takes a lot of money to run for office. It takes a lot of money to compete in elections. And so what we actually have is we don't have political parties in the normal sense. We have fundraising organizations. And those fundraising organizations sometimes then compete in spectator sports, which we call elections. But because you have so many of the same donors donating to both parties, the parties end up basically being different pieces of the same agenda. We don't really have a two-party system with alternatives. We have two variations on the same plutocratic theme. And as a result, what ends up happening is that if one party ends up being so much worse than the other, then this enables the other party to to, 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 to please their donors in a way that might otherwise alienate their base on the basis that the other guys are just more evil. And so I very much expect that any temporary advantage that the Republicans have in this is going to be used not to win more seats in the election, but rather to please a donor class and therefore moderate whatever advantage they have. So that's sort of my view on this. I'm very cynical about U.S. politics. I think that neither of our existing parties can represent the American people, and I think that U.S. grievances are less likely to be resolved than grievances in countries which are outwardly less democratic. And I think that the Mar-a-Lago raid, in conclusion, both demonstrates and exacerbates those problems. What would be required to change my mind on this, by the way, because I think it's important to always keep in mind the limits of our knowledge, is that in the event where you had a criminal case built against Trump that was so watertight that you'd be able to convince a jury where half of them were typical Trump voters, then that would change my mind, okay? But what we've seen through the last couple of years, actually, is this idea that we need to find something to charge Trump with. In other words, we see the man, now we need to find the crime. And, it's really interesting to kind of watch this Bria style prosecution effort take place. So that's what I have to say about this. If you find it interesting, insightful, or useful, I hope I've earned a subscription and a like. Feel free to comment and tell me what you think about all this. At any rate, see you later.